Hi, this is the fourth part of the Ezekiel Daniel screencast for Nyack College. Just to remind you that the following presentation should be viewed in conjunction with Chapter 9 of the course textbook on Daniel. Before we proceed any further, it's worth noting that the book of Daniel in the Hebrew canon does not occupy the same place as it does in the Protestant Bible. Today, the majority of Protestants view the book as a prophetic work because it is, after all, bound together with works such as Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. In the Jewish mindset, however, the most probably due to the apocalyptic content, we're going to come to that later on, the book was placed among the writings as opposed to the prophets. So it would be linked together with books such as Chronicles, Ezra, and Nehemiah. Another interesting fact about the book, which it's worth knowing before we continue, is that it was not all written in Hebrew as most of the other Old Testament books were. Chapters 2 from verse 4 through to chapter 7 verse 28 were written in the Aramaic language. We covered this at the beginning of our course when we were looking at the languages of the Old Testament. It's very similar to Hebrew in that it's written with the same letters. The Hebrew language borrowed the letters actually from Aramaic in this regard, if you remember, and there are many of the same words found between the two languages. His name in Hebrew comprises of two parts. The first, Dani, Dan or Dani, which means my judge or judge, and the second, El, means God. Together, it's possible to interpret the name as my judge is God. Were we to extrapolate the meaning of this name to the man and events in his life, the obvious event to which it relates is when Daniel was cast into the lion's den for worshipping a god other than the king. In this situation, even though the king was forced to pass a judgment of death, God's judgment of life, deliverance from the lions' mouths, outlasted the king's decree. Unlike the book of Isaiah, again, whose authorship, as I'd mentioned before, was disputed, and the whole book, the authorship is disputed in the case of Isaiah by various scholars. Most scholars generally agree a single authorship for the book of Daniel. The main questions that do arise concern the book's date, when it was actually written, but this is something we're going to take a look at a bit later on. Daniel was taken into captivity to Babylon in approximately 605 in what would have been the first wave of exiles. As you recall from the previous lessons, there were three waves of exiles. The first in 605 would have consisted of the cream of Israel's society, the princes and intelligent lawmakers, if you like. They were effectively taken to weaken the kingdom of Judah, but also to strengthen the court of the Babylonian king, since many wise men would have been taken. After this wave, this exilic wave, if you like, there was a second wave taken in 597 that further weakened Judah. And then in 586, the kingdom of Judah was finally destroyed, and the last group of captives were taken. Okay, Daniel would have been a contemporary of both Ezekiel and Jeremiah, but we don't know for certain if they knew each other personally. We know that Daniel 9:2 mentions the ministry of Jeremiah and the prediction as to how long the exile was going to last for. And in addition to that, we could probably speculate that Ezekiel was familiar with Daniel, because Daniel would have had such a high and esteemed position in the king's court. I'm saying this in spite of Ezekiel 14:14, which sounds like a direct reference to Daniel, but as I've mentioned before, it may not be the same Daniel that was in the king's court at the time. The life of Daniel should be compared with other individuals in biblical literature such as Joseph and Esther. We'll come on to this more at the end of this presentation, but it's suffice to say all three of them were Israelites who were taken from their homelands and were exalted to high positions. Daniel, at least for part of his ministry, was considered one of the most powerful men in both the Persian and indeed the Babylonian empires. On to the date of the book itself. Concerning this, there are two prevailing opinions concerning when the book was actually written. The first consensus, if you like, assigns it to an early date during the 5th or 6th century BC. The opening verses of the book clearly locate the book in this approximate era because they speak of the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign as the time when Daniel was taken from Judah as a young boy. With this understanding, we should think of the prophecies spoken within the book, especially of the image of the mixed metals, the idol, the statue of mixed metals in chapter 2, as a reference to the Persian and Greek kingdoms which were to arise. The alternate opinion places the book in a much later era in Israelite history, sometime during the 2nd century. With this understanding, the figure Daniel is associated with a great Jewish hero, and the book was written to help encourage and fuel the Maccabean revolt. In this context, chapter 11, 29, 39 chapters 11 verse 29 to 39 is a direct reference to Antiochus Epiphanes, who instigated the abomination of desolation, as it's called, which was in actual fact the sacrificing of a pig on the altar of the temple. Those who read the book of Daniel in this way see it more as a coded reflection of historical events and not so much as a prophetic and predictive work. The events that occur in the book were already known by the author in this case and were not actually foretold. One of the major questions concerning the latter view of Daniel concerns how it was raised to such an exalted status, a semi or quasi-canonical stage at such a short space of time. The fact that fragments of the Dead Sea Scrolls reflecting the Book of Qumran, certain fragments were found there, but they suggest that that by the end of the 2nd century, the book had already achieved a holy status. Such a short period of time for this level of textual sanctification seems a bit strange. What normally happens when a text is written is that after the events occur, the text is written, it would normally take an amount of time, if you like, and after that time, if there are prophecies within that text, after the prophecies come true, then the text, if you like, is raised to this being a holy status. But with this second idea that Daniel is a product of the 2nd century, this actual time seems a bit strange, if you like. Before we look at the structure and contents of the book, a few words need to be said about the type or genre of literature that parts of this book represent. The second half of the book, chapters 7 to 12, reflects what we call apocalyptic literature. A number of features characterize apocalyptic literature, and we are briefly going to look at a few of those right now. The first feature is that of hyperbolic imagery, which is to say exaggerated, fantastic, and imaginative images or pictures found within the text. These usually come in the form of strange-looking beasts with wings and the heads of various creatures, or mountains that move and take on human characteristics. In Daniel chapter 7:4, for example, we see the description of a lion with the wings of an eagle. Further on in chapter 8, we read of rams with misplaced horns. It's the type of thing indeed we saw as well in Ezekiel, in the chapter which I had read earlier on concerning the vision that he saw in chapter 1. Another feature, another characteristic feature of apocalyptic literature is that they frequently contain visions of the future. Frequently, but not exclusively, apocalyptic texts are foretelling prophecies that tell of things which are to take place. The main idea behind this is that the people of God can be forewarned and not dismayed, but prepared when any catastrophes, particularly that may occur, that may be prophesied, actually come about. Frequently, within apocalyptic literature, there is a conflict of some description, or a time of oppression between the people of God and enemy forces. And at some point within this conflict, there is a direct and climactic intervention by God into the battle. He comes in to ultimately save and deliver those who have been faithful to him. A major distinguishing factor that separates apocalyptic literature from normal prophetic literature is the degree of secrecy. At some stage, normally in apocalyptic texts, during the recounting of things to come, the person who hears the message or sees the message is told to conceal what he has learned for a specific time, and only to reveal the contents of that message when the time is right. Contextually, it's important to note that apocalyptic prophecies frequently come at a time when the intended audience is suffering through a period of distress or duress. The people of God are usually suffering under oppression when the apocalyptic prophecies are received. Consequently, it is wise to assume that the prophecies are primarily meant to provide a degree of hope and encouragement to the recipients. The final characteristic of apocalyptic literature is that the message is usually delivered to a human agent via an angelic intermediary. Such a figure frequently serves as an interpreter for visions seen by the recipient of the message. Please bear in mind that not all of the features described above need necessarily be present for a piece of literature to be deemed apocalyptic. You may just find one or two elements absent from all of the description here, and yet you may still well be looking at an apocalyptic text. Before continuing to the contents of Daniel, a word of caution must be mentioned concerning the interpretation of apocalyptic literature. Today, as Christians, we're frequently fascinated by the mystical and the secret. And because the moral teachings of the Bible prevent us from pursuing after the things of the world, such as horoscopes and mediums, many people flee to apocalyptic literature to satisfy their desire for secret and hidden knowledge. The overriding principle that all should keep in mind when reading this genre is that God is more concerned with how we behave in the present than he is in what we know about the future.